we're now on to the final part of this mini lecture, and it's on molecular search. So search is all about how do we find the molecules that we want, how do we traverse the chemical space. And to begin with, I think it's important to try to define what does search mean, and often search is described as trying to find a trajectory, a series of repeated construction modifications to be able to move from a starting molecule to a final goal molecule, applying multiple transformations sequentially. So, for example, here, using reaction-based design, you can start from this small molecule here, and you can apply 1, 2, 3, 4 different transformations in sort of series, and this will be able to then traverse the space. But one of the key things to keep in mind with search, and this is really the challenge of search, is each possible choice that we have at each stage can be our entire total of reaction transformations in this example, or the number of fragments in our fragment library, or the number of atoms or different types of atom-based transformations we can apply. And we can clearly see that in this case we had 4,500 possible reactions to choose from in this example, which led us to sort of be able to identify a trajectory of 1 in 4,500 to the power of 4. So, we're talking a very, very large space that needs to be traversed, and it's almost effectively impossible to exhaustively enumerate. It's almost impossible to be able to look at all of it. And really, search is how do we balance the exploration of the space versus exploitation of the space. So how do we explore it to find more information, and then how do we exploit it to find the best possible molecules? Just to kind of highlight why we need search, strategic search is really required because chemical space is so vast, and it's argued that it's around 10 to the power of 60 possible molecules. Therefore, we're going to have to take a sample of this space. We cannot look at every possible combination. Sometimes described as a needle in a haystack type problem. We are searching for the needle in a haystack. I think it's probably easier to say we are actually looking for a needle in many haystacks, and these haystacks are of impossible size. So really, it's important. Strategic search is required because it needs to be used to reduce the possible space to something that is actually tractable. Again, similar to construction, molecule search sits on a spectrum. So on the left-hand side, we could imagine that there are search approaches which are fully deterministic. So fully deterministic search is where we have rule-based or systematic enumeration or optimization-driven methods which are consistently all the time selecting the same compounds, the same transformations at each step. On the other hand, we have stochastic search, and in stochastic search, this is where we are relying on more of a probabilistic framework. So we're trying to say, okay, given 10 transformations, randomly choose one of them. So this is the form of a Monte Carlo type method, so Monte Carlo sampling. In the middle then, we kind of have hybrid approaches, and hybrid approaches are where we take a little bit of deterministic and a little bit of stochastic, and we try to find that balance. So in the case of, for example, simulated annealing, as we'll come on to, this is where we start stochastically and then we reduce into a deterministic scheme. But certainly there are many, many different approaches. This is just a sort of brief flavor. So to begin with then, we'll start with systematic enumeration. So systematic enumeration is where, given a set of transformations, we are going to apply all of them and we're going to generate all possible molecules. And this could be, for example, systematically enumerating all possible atoms in a molecular graph. So this is how the algorithm Surge works. So Surge works first by defining a molecular graph and then effectively transforming each of the nodes into an atom and then enumerating all possible combinations of atoms. And this is how you can generate an awful large number of chemical structures, but of course, just because you can generate a valid SMILE string from your systematic enumeration doesn't mean you can make these molecules in practice. So systematic enumeration guarantees complete coverage, but that complete coverage doesn't necessarily mean that we can actually make everything that we design. But certainly it is a search strategy. It is check every possible solution. On to deterministic search, and deterministic search follows a collection of sort of explicit rules. It's usually rule-based enumeration methods. So this might be where, for example, we, instead of applying all possible transformations, instead we apply just a subset of them, but we have a sequential sort of scheme that we follow. So we could start off with, say, applying match pairs, then we move on to reactions, then we filter, then we apply more reactions, and so on until we eventually reach a kind of endpoint. At that endpoint, we then do some possible post-generation scoring, and that post-generation scoring then forms the final pool, and that final pool of molecules is what we will go ahead and make. So an example here is Auto Designer from Schrödinger. Here we start from a starting ligand, and from that starting ligand, we then transform it over and over again, following this sort of cascade, this sort of sequential application of rules until we eventually arrive at applying FEP. One of the key things with any form of deterministic search and rule-based approaches, we're often generating many millions of molecules as we're repeatedly applying enumeration strategies. So we can see here that we are generating, in this case, 353 million compounds using the Auto Designer type approach. However, the nice thing is that presuming the starting ligand and given the same starting ligand, we will always get to the same pool at the end. The next method, again, kind of sits in the deterministic space, is this idea of hill climbing and greedy search. So in the case of hill climbing greedy search, we may not necessarily choose all possible transformations. Instead, we will only generate molecules which we know will score favorably. That is, if a molecule, when we have generated it, is better than the molecule we started from based upon our scoring, we throw away all other solutions. What this means is that our actions, so long as we can score them, or our transformation methods, we can score them, what that will mean is that we can keep on applying the same transformations until eventually we reach some kind of local optimum. Hill climbing is very nice for this because we can see that we start from this point here, and then as we sort of progress up our scoring function, we keep on applying transformations, moving up the hill until we reach a local optimum. The reason why we can't go down the hill then is because when we're thinking about applying transformations sequentially, it means that we would actually have to generate a molecule that scores better than the place that we are right now. That means that ultimately we can get trapped in a local optimum, not knowing whether or not there is a better scoring molecule somewhere in the space. Greedy takes the same approximation. We can have a look at greedy. So we start from, for example, molecule 7. We have two transformations. We could apply a greedy algorithm and take the value of 12, a molecule with a score of 12. And then again, if we applied the greedy algorithm, we would then take the molecule score of 6. The problem is that the actual best path would be to take initially the score of 3, which is worse than 12. And as that will lead to us to a molecule with a score of 99. The problem with this approach is quite obvious now, is that it's very easy to get trapped in what appears to be good scoring molecules when actually there could be some better scoring molecules elsewhere. So to kind of combat this, often we will use some sort of middle ground. And what is this middle ground? So this is, for example, epsilon-greedy. So in epsilon-greedy, we do a similar type of process, and in epsilon-greedy, what we do is we say, okay, we will follow a greedy process. We will apply the best transformation we can. However, with a certain probability, we will randomly select a modification. So instead of just saying, okay, I'm going to pick the best every time, I sometimes choose and say, actually, I'll pick a random transformation. And this little bit of randomness introduces then the ability to be able to traverse the space in a wider manner. It means that we no longer have to get trapped inside local optimum. We can explore more of the space. And in this plot, we can see, for example, epsilon-greedy versus greedy search. So the black dotted line here is greedy, and this is because we start here, and then very quickly we move up the hill, and we identify this local optimum here. On the other hand, the epsilon-greedy, as shown in green here, will go away, and it will randomly move to a different part of the search space, and then it will begin its greedy move upwards. And eventually it will, by happenstance, eventually fall upon the global maximum. And you can see very quickly, in fact, even after less than 40, in fact, it's only sort of 15 iterations, you can identify scores which are better than the original greedy search. So this means that by introducing a little bit of stochasticness, we can actually improve our overall search. So a sort of extension of epsilon-greedy then is to start thinking about how can we dynamically change the amount of randomness we have. And one approach is with this idea of simulated annealing. So simulated annealing relies on the idea that at the beginning of a search, we will be fully stochastic, and by the end of the search, we will be fully deterministic, we'll be fully greedy. And it does this by relying upon what is known as the Boltzmann criterion. And effectively what it says is that, okay, at the beginning of my search, I will randomly choose whatever transformations I like, but by the end of the search, I will only choose those which will improve the position I am in right now. And what this is that this will allow us at the initial part of the search, the initial stage of the search, it allows us to traverse any part of the search space we like. However, by the end, it will say that we can only move to positions that improve ourselves overall. And what this means is that as we sort of slowly identify this region here, we identify then that this is the best possible position. We cannot move left, we cannot move right, we have to stay where we are. And this is really only possible at the end when we have reached a cool temperature. We have removed all of that sort of randomness and gone purely greedy. And I think it's kind of interesting when we think about these type of algorithms, because actually there has been a lot of research exploring how do medicinal chemistry programs move through chemical space. And for this, actually, you can look at this nice paper where they try to do some modeling of compound optimization. And you can actually see that at the beginning, very much, they sort of stochastically move around the space. And then very quickly they identify sort of a pathway and reduce the amount of sort of stochasticness and identify the key area of interest. And this is very sort of reminiscent of the idea of at the beginning of a project, you may have to do a lot of wide sampling, and then you very much at the end of the project want to narrow in on a region of interest. So I don't think any foundations course in generative design would not now be without some description of machine learning. So in machine learning, we try to learn different ways to navigate chemical space efficiently, really trying to use the data that we have generated either in our projects or from the public domain. And there are many different strategies, all of which fuse different approaches such as atom-based construction or fragment-based construction or reaction-based construction. And it very much will differ depending upon the approach that is used and the data that we have to hand. Some sort of classic methods that have recently sort of become popular are recurrent neural networks. This is where we sort of use string-based approaches and a probabilistic framework to be able to build smile strings, new smile strings based upon data. Flow-based approaches, variational autoencoders, these are sort of taking the latent space from a data-driven descriptor and then trying to traverse that latent space. generative adversarial networks. This is where we take some noise and we apply it to a generator, and then we provide a discriminator to try to traverse the space. Or reinforcement learning, where we actually try to build a reward function and use that to train an agent which can traverse the space. These sort of techniques are much more advanced. They're not really, I'm not going to talk about them more in this course. However, I think that it will be good to be able to try to explore them in the future. So just to kind of wrap up now, I think one of the key challenges about search is really thinking then about how obviously big chemical space is, but then also how do we overcome multiple minima. So it can be often the case that based upon what we currently know now, may not actually be a property that will lead us to our global optimum. And we can clearly see here that this challenge is that the chemical space is absolutely full of discontinuities, holes, lack of data. It's very hard to be able to identify globally the best sort of solution. In fact, even just looking at this image, it is hard to identify it. So when we're thinking about search, we have to also then say, okay, how do we know, or how can we guarantee that we will find better solutions than we start off with now? And that's really the idea of then validating search approaches. It's not something we're going to talk about in this sort of course, but it'll be something that hopefully we can come back to at a later date. So just to finally wrap up, where is generative design moving in the future? At least in my opinion right now. So really, it's starting to think about how does generative design continue to evolve with new emerging technologies. So at the moment we have, the scientists in the lab designing new hypotheses, and then we use generative design to go away and build molecules and have those molecules made and tested and see if we can accept or reject those sort of lab scientists made hypotheses. And instead, maybe in the future, we'll then also start to think about, can a computer generate those scoring functions? Can a computer generate those hypotheses based upon the data? And then we then think about, moving through then to synthesis and testing, perhaps instead of it being made by hand in glass, perhaps one day we'll start to think about robotic synthesis and testing and trying to bring this all together in a single closed loop where a computer is defining what the hypothesis is and then go away and have those sort of made using new synthetic methodologies.